So we touched in the last episode around a number of areas where we can see that if we get political backing and support from the markets, we can actually see renewable energy start to transition. But I wanted to touch on one specific one. We saw it in Germany, the boiler ban, and that I might have it completely wrong. So correct me if I've missed anything else. But it was when that was brought in, there seemed to be a huge rush to buy boilers. To essentially kind of safeguard against the ban coming in. So even if your boiler wasn't necessarily broken or needed repair, and there was homes that were having them fitted to get the 10-year warranty to kind of, I suppose, prevent the need for them to have a heat pump in a distressed situation. Where do we see the boiler ban in the UK? Because there was talk about it at one point, and I know there was a lot of pressure to kind of push it back and get rid of it. Where are we at now with it?
So the first point to probably make is that we had both separate dates basically for off gas grid homes, so people who had a oil boiler, LPG boiler, other types of boilers, and then a different phase out date for on gas grid properties, so if you have a gas boiler. And the off gas grid phase out was initially set for 2026, but that was scrapped by the Conservative government, I think in 2023, just because they had concerns that basically people weren't ready to switch to things like heat pumps, because that would probably be the main solution for off-gas grid homes. So that was pushed back to 2035, which was the same date that the on-gas grid boiler phase out was. So yeah, the Conservative government, but this is the thing, it was never really a ban. It was just a target to phase out these boilers by from 2035. And there's a bit of confusion around that, because they weren't saying that if you have a gas boiler or an oil boiler, you have to rip it out, even if it's working. That was never the policy. It was next time your boiler breaks, you have to get a different non-fossil fuel solution. So it was never ripping out boilers, and that's what it became in the press, in the media, and that's what people would, they're going to rip out my boiler. Well, that was never what was going to happen.
Yeah, I think there wasn't the talk at one point about literally Boris he was going to go into people's houses and start ripping them out.
Yeah, well, I had to tell my granny, said, that's the Daily Mail granny. I wouldn't believe it if I were you. So it's one of them where it was never going to be this violent rip out your boiler situation, but that's what it felt like it became. And then in September 2023, when it was Rishi Sunak who was Prime Minister, he then said that as part of his wider net zero rollback, so he did this speech, and basically he said actually 1 in 5 homes, no idea how they were going to calculate or find which 1 in 5 it was, but they said 1 in 5 homes won't have to do that anymore. So 20% of you can still have your gas boiler after 2035. But he was also fanning the flames and saying things like, we're never going to force you to rip out your boiler, when nobody had ever suggested that they were. So he was fanning the flames on that sort of language and making it quite unhelpful, really. So we're now in a bit of a stage where we don't quite know what the policy is. The current government, the Labour government, the new one, hasn't said very much at all on heat decarbonisation, but it's only been a month or so. So we can't really blame them for that, given other priorities and things that happen at the moment. But I think it does mean that we need some sort of direction, because as the industry, how do you know what to invest in? How do you know what plans to make as a consumer? How do you know the same thing? How do you know what to buy if there's no long-term strategy or policy set? So I think that's going to be quite an important thing for the government to get to grips with, because if they don't have a long-term plan, the installers, the gas boiler manufacturers, the consumers, none of us know what we're doing. So I think it'll be important for them to get back on track with that. And people like the Climate Change Committee, the International Energy Agency, they've all pointed to you need to have a phase-out date set, because that helps with the long-term signalling. And other countries all across the world have got phase-out dates set. You touched on Germany, theirs was 2026, but they ended up pushing that back after some resistance. And it was an interesting one, because in Germany they had a coalition government where it was the Greens with another party that I can't remember. And there was a bit of tension there anyway. And then the Greens policy on the boiler phase out pushed it a little bit too far. And there was quite a lot of backlash. But yeah, I always think it's funny, this language of they're going to rip out your boiler, because no one was ever suggesting that. So it's one of those things where I think some facts being inserted into the debate is quite helpful.
Yeah, it can get fanned right the way across the if you're an installer of boilers, why would you be in favour of heat pumps if you're not trained and certified to fit the technology? But I do, one of the challenges, we talk about a lot about people having enough skills in the industry. But before we get into that one, there does seem to be a little bit around our actual infrastructure, as in our electricity infrastructure. And I do find in a lot of cases we get kind of encouraged to talk kind of holistically around the whole energy market and policy and the incentives and funds and how we manage the electricity generation. But every now and then, I feel it's quite good to just come down to like individual people in a home and what they face, and we see it in various different ways. We've had people come through that are 100%. They're putting a heat pump in, and there's been barriers in the way, specifically the network operators, the ability to connect the heat pump to that home and get approval to do that. We've had people where they've said, yeah, you can have it. We've actually got a customer at the moment. They're being faced with a 6 to 8 week wait for somebody for the network operator to come in and disconnect the loop supply in their home. Now, okay, that customer has a working boiler, and they're quite happy to wait those 6 to 8 weeks before we start the integration of the installation. But at the same time, there's plenty that if that was a distress purchase, waiting 6 to 8 weeks to get hot water back on just isn't an option. Do we see that kind of investment in infrastructure? Do we see that being pushed from at government level for the network operators to move these things forward?
The infrastructure, you're absolutely right. At the moment, the infrastructure that's in place is not going to see us out till 2050, 2100. It's not really fit for the future. And it's on both sides. So it's on the transmission side where basically the transmission side is the long high voltage cables that go cross country through pylons. And then also on the distribution side, which is what you were talking about, when the power goes into people's homes, that's lower voltage, and that's in the neighborhoods, in the substations and things like that. I actually read somewhere in one of the papers that electric vehicles and heat pumps meant that we were going to have to dig up all of the electricity wires and redo them all. And that's not the case. It's a case of upgrading certain parts of the energy system. So the substations, some of the pylons. Yes, we will need more pylons because we're building more power stations. But it's one of them where, like you said, holistically, there's a lot of change that's required, and having a long-term plan in place, I think, will be really, really useful. And that's something that the government has been told by independent advisors, that it should do a long-term spatial plan. So I think they've committed to it, and I think we probably will see that in the not too distant future. But as you said, we can't be having a situation where you have to wait to get a heat pump or upgrade your electricity infrastructure in order to get these solutions in place, because a distress purchase is just not going to wait that long. So I think it is very much about changing our perspective on things so that we're not having to do this all at the last minute. And the network companies definitely should be thinking about how they can make it easier for their customers, because they're going to be getting more and more and more of these requests. It's in their own interests to start sorting it out sooner rather than later. But the infrastructure projects, the national grids investing heavily, Ofgem are involved. The government, I'm not sure whether they're directly involved with investment, but the national grid and the individual companies definitely are. And yeah, it seems absolutely backwards that some renewables generators having to wait 10 years for a connection to the gas grid, and then you're saying customers have to wait weeks and weeks for their connection to get their electricity grid infrastructure in place as well. It's delays on both sides that just need to be eradicated if we're going to start seeing these changes. It's not practical, I think, in a lot of cases. We see it even with, imagine putting a heat pump onto somebody's home. Yes, you're increasing the amps required, therefore the cutout rating of the fuse that's needed. But we also see it going the other way if we're putting generation onto somebody's home and trying to, and the potential for feeding back into the grid. We've actually had applications where we've had to throttle back the capabilities of the technology in terms of what it can put back into the grid. So that at the same time, though, we're working on some really exciting projects at the moment where we're looking to do half-hourly demand flexibility. So with the connections we have through to the technology, actually being able to shift that demand to support the grid, which my understanding of how that can support is that it means less upgrades. If you can optimize and control the technology in a particular home, then you haven't got to do as much digging up of the ground or additional power lines going in. But I think when we talk about the boiler ban and ripping out boilers in people's homes and replacing it, forcing people to have heat pumps, the reality is at the moment, even if there was a political driver to do that, the infrastructure from a network perspective isn't there. But
but also the infrastructure from an installation and from installers capable of doing these installations isn't there. We talked a little bit before the show around how we can, we're seeing more people coming in. People like yourself also coming into it from different angles, not necessarily, I think when we talked before the show, the traditional route for somebody going into geology would have been then to go and support the gas and oil networks, but yours led you into the renewables space. Are we seeing that more? Are you seeing more people from the courses that you did starting to make that decision, or were you the outlier and everyone else is working for big oil and gas?
No, definitely not. So yeah, I did geology. When did I start? It was 10 years ago now, so 2014. And that was really the turning point where it became very obvious that there was no long-term careers or no long-term future in oil and gas. I wasn't going to work in that industry for the next 60 years. It wasn't going to be the case. So lots of my friends and people on my course did go into the renewable energy space. I've got friends who do like renewable project insurance, actually building the renewables. A lot of them work on projects like new nuclear plants and things like that. And hardly any of them went down the traditional route of oil and gas exploration. And I think that is a sign of the times, because the writing was clearly on the wall for all of us. And also people don't want to work in industries that add to climate change. It's just, the younger generation, especially, and the ones underneath mine, certainly don't want to go into a job that's going to exacerbate climate change. They want to do something that helps with climate change. And year on year, month on month, we're seeing more and more climate change impacts across the world. And it is an undeniable fact now that this is happening, and it's happening now. So I think, definitely most of my friends did go into more renewables than oil and gas. And I think that's true of what's happening with the heat pumps and gas boiler engineer space as well, where if you weren't particularly academic at school, you might have gone to do a plumber's course or a hairdressing course or something like that. And now I think that the HPA, the Heat Pump Association, have been working with higher education providers in getting a low carbon heating apprenticeship out and low carbon heating modules under different plumbing courses and things like that. So we're reaching the point where it is getting more widespread, but a lot of the current workforce are older and they are looking to retire, and you have to bring through that new talent where they know there's going to be a long-term future. And if the policy is brought in where there's going to be no gas boilers beyond a certain date, if it's going to be 2035, really we need to be training up people now, because we're only 10 years out from there. And I think that the younger people are going to be a really essential part of that, and helping them to get the right training when they leave school, and getting the gas boiler manufacturers to be a bit more diverse in what they offer heat pump training as well as gas boiler training. Because I think the reality is that if you're trained up on a certain gas boiler manufacturer, you'll install that for the rest of your career. And that might be the case too with heat pumps, but there's not as many heat pump engineers being trained. But we are starting to see more and more. So I think Octopus Energy are training up some heat pump engineers, and I think Valent might be as well. And it's all about getting those ducks in a row now, so that we have that workforce of the future. Yeah,
we need it. And I think there's, I think back to when I did my apprenticeship, and actually I did the traditional college course and the learnings there, but actually the majority of what I learned was from working for a company that was innovative and that was pushing the boundaries and doing a lot in the renewable energy space. And there was formal craft qualifications that you have to pick up along the way, but actually being in a position where I was working with renewable technology every day. Thankfully, I never actually had to do anything with gas boilers, and the learnings I picked up there. If you see these people coming through now, more and more companies that are doing renewable technologies, the installers that are getting into this space on an apprenticeship level, or even maybe staying outside of those formal craft qualifications and just joining these companies and getting that hands-on experience, they're being exposed to heat pumps, they're being exposed to solar and batteries, and it's actually becoming normalized. It's not necessarily something that this is an exciting opportunity for me. It actually becomes that is just your route in, because these are the technologies they fit. But we have seen and heard more people that are making those conscious choices. If you're a company that is installing renewables, you've got a higher probability of picking up an apprentice than somebody who isn't. And we are seeing a wider mix of both male and female coming into the market, where historically it's been more male led.
And that's really important as well, because I mean, traditionally in the engineering construction space, there's not that many women, not that many female people anyway. But seeing more female installers would be really beneficial, I think, for the industry as a whole. And that's because different consumers, different customers respond differently to different installers, right? And if you're, I don't know, a little old lady and you need a new heat pump putting in, you might be more inclined to ask questions of a female installer. You might be more inclined to get involved and then pass on that word of mouth learnings that you've had to your friends and family. I mean, you know more about the installer side of things than me, definitely. But I do think having females in the space is really important because it just brings a different perspective and different connections with different customers. As I said, I mean, I'm a bit of a nightmare because I live in a rented house and we get our gas safe certificate every year. The landlord sends the guy around, and I'm always asking him questions. What do you think about these heat pumps, or what do you think about hydrogen heating? And it's really interesting to see over the years how that has shifted a bit. At first, it was the guy was saying, hydrogen definitely is going to be the future. Don't worry about these heat pumps, love, kind of thing. Like, don't worry about that. But more and more, I've started to see him say, I've had a lot of things, people asking me about what the future is going to be because they've heard about the gas boiler ban or they've heard about this, that, and the other. And I think it's absolutely true that these things will come organically. But also I think it's absolutely true that it will need a little push to get not only more people, but more diverse people into the workforce, because the government has a huge role to play in setting out the future, and people will listen to the plan and people will see what the future is and then be more inclined to go into jobs that they see having a future.
Yeah. And I think it's nice that the way we're seeing people coming through, it's not necessarily from a box ticking exercise of diversification. It's organic. People are coming into it because actually the industry is of interest and there's potential and that it's growing and there's market drivers to get into it. So people, both male and female, are making this decision to come in. Whereas, I don't know what the drivers would have been historically and why we were more male orientated as an industry. But I certainly we see within Heatio in a small space the impact of having a diverse workforce, people coming at it from different areas, how communication to customers can be different. And I think I think you're absolutely right. Actually, in those scenarios where people may have those questions and feel more confident asking them of a female over a male, but historically people haven't had that choice. I think that's been the maybe the biggest challenge. And if we then say, okay, we need to give people that choice, and we have to, and we're forced to give it through diversification criteria. Actually, now we're able to give that choice because the industry is appealing for people to come into it that have those drivers that want to be able to provide that information. Yep. And there's some fantastic companies. There's a company called Your Energy, Your Way, and when I talk about them, they're a quality installer. Yes, the second part is they're all female installer. And it's kind of like that should be the secondary, because they're an amazing business. They're doing some great work. I seen an installation that they did under the Heat Pump Ready program. They've done some great work with Samsung, and it's that, champion that, and the fact that they are bringing females into the industry, which will improve the communication and the quality and the service that we get. But how do we make that more? How do we get more diversification into the industry?
It's great question. I think a lot of it comes back to the wider sector of engineering, construction, science, technology. I mean, typically in the past, they have been very male-dominated subjects. And I mean, I did 2 science degrees and they were male-dominated. And it's a case of having that foundation in place where engineering becomes more attractive to more diverse people. And I don't quite know how you do that, but I think having role models in place is very important. People can see people who look like them doing jobs and saying, I want to do that too. But as you said, it should end up basically being the situation where you don't care what people look like or anything about them except that they're a good installer and they know what they're doing. Yeah. But it is important that I think people start to see people like themselves in jobs that they want to do, and trying to get it from when they're in school all the way through as well.
And how do you find it in the industry?
Well, it is very male dominated, especially the heating world. I mean, it's less so than like the transport world. I've got colleagues who do electric vehicles and transport, and that's incredibly male dominated. But I was actually saying to a colleague the other day, it makes a huge difference to me personally if I go into a room and I'm not the only woman there. And actually, I find that if I am the only woman there, even though I am pretty confident and I know hopefully what I'm talking about, it can make me less wanting to put my hand up or wanting to contribute to the discussion if it's just a bunch of blokes. And really? if there's other women in the room, I just feel more like I've got a place here, and what I say matters. And it's not, I don't want to come across completely woke and lefty, but it is important because it makes people feel like they can speak up more. And having more diverse perspectives in the room, half the customer base for your products is probably women, right? Because half the population is women. So making sure that their perspectives are reflected in discussions that go on, particularly at a policy level as well, is very important, because it can mean the difference between somebody speaking up and doing something or not.
100%. I always think when we look at the client base that comes through, and we've actually we're in the middle of a trial at the moment with the Living Lab from Energy Systems Catapult, and if you talk just commercially about the approach, who is the decision maker in the home? And there's more females that are leading that decision in the home in that trial. Relatively small trial, but there's more females that are responsible for making the decision, responsible for the financial situation in the home than males. So they're the ones monitoring the energy bill. They're the ones knowing how much the direct debits are. Yep. And ultimately, and if I just talk about this commercially from a hetero perspective, if we speak to the male in the home who's looking after those bills and making those decisions, the terminology they use is, I've obviously got to go and check with the boss. Whereas when we are dealing with females who are monitoring the energy bills and knowing how much they pay, when they make their decision, the guy is going to be told, we're going for this technology. Yep. So just commercially for us, the opportunity to sell and install the technology and that sales process is far easier when you're dealing with the female who's taking charge of the home and the finances. But there seems to be a kind of a mindset and a rhetoric that actually, the guys deal with that stuff. Yeah. But we're seeing it daily, that the decisions get sat there, and actually the communication and the process we have to go through. When we're doing a heat pump installation, there's so many hurdles you have to go through, and the engagement that you need in that process to stay on that journey all the way through. So I think encouraging more females into this industry and actually having been able to have those kind of female to female conversations, it's hugely important to actually see that more technology going out into the world. Yeah. And so you're setting a trend.
Girl power.
Girl power, definitely. But do you find that when you're obviously quite vocal in your views as well, do you find that you get the negative side of that any different to, I put posts out on Twitter and on Hannah, what's the other one we use? TikTok. My God, when I put stuff out on TikTok, it's just, you have to be quite strong-minded because you do get some direct abuse on there. Do you find the same?
Yeah, I do actually, especially on, it's called X now, isn't it? But everyone still calls it Twitter. Yeah. But on X, definitely. And I get a lot of people, interestingly, basically asking me if I'm an engineer, and I don't have an engineering background, but it doesn't mean I'm not qualified to talk about what I talk about. And I hate to say it, but it is 100% men who always say, well, what are your qualifications? Are you an engineer? Really? Or what's your engineering experience? Things like that. And I can understand it because they want to know that I'm not just some idiot who doesn't know what they're talking about, and that's fine. But compared to what some of my male colleagues get, it is very different, and the tone of which people speak to me is different to them. And it doesn't really bother me because they don't actually know me, these people. I'm never going to meet them in real life. But it is striking sometimes to compare the different responses that we get to very similar tweets. Whereas people will still disagree with my colleagues, but it won't be as personal, it won't be as targeted, it won't be asking about my age or, what my experience is and things like that. But it's a fact of life that you're always you can be the ripest, juiciest peach in the world and there'll be someone who don't like peaches. It's one of them. It's like, if they don't like me, they don't like me. But it doesn't, it does. I think Marilyn Monroe said that actually, but it doesn't take away from my knowledge. And I think it's very important that as a woman, you still carry on with what you're doing and don't let people bring you down.
And I think that's it. Actually, when we stand behind it all, what we're championing is actually the right thing. We're championing people switching to renewable energy. You're championing certainly policy change in this space. So it's for the greater good. And actually, whether somebody's a male or a female that sits behind it, it shouldn't make any difference. But
we'll get there.
We will. Yeah, we'll keep on pushing. Well, thank you very much for coming on. You mentioned in the previous show you're Northwest based, so you're now. Are you staying up in Liverpool now, or are you going? Was it Liverpool you were from then?
I'm from Formby. So actually, Formby, I believe, was one of the first places in the world that had an onshore oil well.
Okay.
So I don't know if somehow energy's in my blood, but from Formby originally. And it was really interesting actually growing up in Formby because there was the whole fracking debate. It's very close to one of the potential fracking sites.
Oh, really?
And it's something I studied when I was at school. And it was just, really interesting how energy interplays everywhere. And, people who don't even think they know anything about energy probably do somewhere along the line. So,
And certainly start reacting. The fracking one was a big one, wasn't it?
It was indeed, yeah. I've never seen resistance like it. It was, businessmen to grannies to people with young children to, everybody was sort of united in saying, we don't want this. And we don't want our town to become a test bed for it. I think the reality is that in the UK, it's not Texas. We haven't got huge swathes of land where nobody lives and nobody has an interest in. It's not just a deserted place. I think the UK is a very different place, especially Lancashire and Merseyside. And I don't think that coming in and saying that you're making all these promises about how much oil and gas you're going to get from fracking is realistic, because the geology is so fundamentally different. We've got more fault lines and places where it's a lot less concentrated. So you'd never be able to get out the amounts that they get out in Texas anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully that one stays good and buried.
Well, it brought down Liz Truss in the end, didn't it? So I don't think anyone will be reviving that anytime soon.
Hopefully not. Well, enjoy your time in Liverpool. And thank you very much.